guys, it's a new sensation, Big Annotation here, and today I'm coming to you with another Star Wars Unlimited deck profile. This time it will be on the REY green deck. I've literally just arrived home from the London Planetary Qualifier just in the last 10 minutes, so I've just been getting set up and ready to share this deck with you guys. I ended up finishing 16th place with this list, going 5-2. I'll go through the matchups a little bit later, but I was 5-1 up until the last round, and I lost out on the top cut on the last round, unfortunately. So I ended up 5-2 and then dropped all the way down to 16th, but still made top 16, which was nice. Purely based off tiebreakers, of course. I think that this list is really solid. I think that REY Green might be the better way to play REY right now into the current meta. Obviously, we'll see how that goes and develops moving forward. I know there's going to be a lot of shakeups as we move forward with more PQs going on, and there already has been a lot of new decks coming to Rise. So, in my opinion, right now, this is probably the best way to play REY. I've messed around with some REY Red and REY Blue builds. I'm not super experienced on REY Yellow, but I will probably have a look into that as well, because I've just been really enjoying the way that the leader plays recently, and it offers quite a lot into the current meta just as a standalone leader, with its own color with just blue heroic cards. Also, let me know how the audio quality is for this video, because I've just got a new microphone, so I'm hoping that it's all a little bit crispy. But yeah, we'll jump straight into things. So the first thing that I wanted to cover really is, why did I choose to play REY Green? And there's a couple of reasons for that, really. The first one is REY gets a lot of comparison to the Luke leader, of course, because they're very similar. Both deploy on 6. They both have an action that costs 1 tap themselves to buff one of their units. REY obviously gives an experience to a unit with 2 power or less, whereas Luke gives a shield to a unit that you've played that phase that's heroic. So both very similar leaders, both offer very similar things to the table. I've just felt like REY was a much more flexible leader than Luke. You don't have to play the unit the turn that you buff it, so it allows you to fill out your curve a lot more consistently throughout the game. It means that, if you want to cast a removal spell, or you're not playing a unit that matches the condition, then you're also able to spend your remaining mana on that. But it also means that you can, at the start of the phase, buff a unit that's already on the board as well, as opposed to having to play the unit to then buff it straight afterwards, which can often get you out of ranges that are available on the board, like trading into the opponent's units. The opponent might want to trade into one of your units, and if you buff it out of the range, then they're not able to do that anymore, whereas Luke can't really do that. It's a little bit slower with Luke. And the same sort of thing with removal spells. If you think that your opponent might try and take down one of your units and you can buff it up to 6 health, then you can do that as well. So it really feels a lot more flexible than Luke when it comes to actually playing the leader. And then a big reason why I also wanted to play REY was because once you flip, your leader actually becomes kind of a card that can carry the game on itself a lot of the time against certain decks, just because it has the Restore 3 tag, and if you're able to get that first swing through, it becomes 7 health, which is kind of the premium health total for leaders nowadays, I feel like. You do have to be really careful once you deploy it. The next action, if your opponent maybe has a surprise strike, or has that ECL available, that sort of thing, there are a lot of ways that they can deal with a 6 health leader on the flip. But as soon as you get that first swing through and buff it to a 3/7, it becomes really tricky to deal with. And you are also able to oftentimes just block up the ground arena on your flip turn with a lot of sentinels and stuff. And then as she stays on the board, she's able to provide you constant value by buffing up all of your other units as well. So she's really able to just carry the game on her own as a leader. Once you get that first attack off, you're then swinging 6 health every turn, because you're swinging for 3 and restoring the 3. So you're able to just start racing down aggro decks as soon as you've stabilized and flipped. Unless they're already in kill range of you, then you're kind of just able to start racing them down, which is really good. You'll often have a lot of other units with Restore that are able to help with that as well. So that's a big reason why I wanted to play Ray over Luke there. Going into the turn 1 plays, and this is where I'll also expand a little bit on why I wanted to play Ray. The turn 1 plays, the main turn 1 plays that really made me want to play Ray were these 6 here, the R2D2 and the Moisture Farmer. I found that this was really, really important because especially a little bit earlier into the meta, there was a lot more Django and Cad Tarkin Town running around. And just like Tarkin Town decks in general, even Quinlan is another great example of that. As the meta has developed a little bit, there is a little bit less Tarkin Town running around, I'd say, than earlier on, but there is still like a high prevalence of that card and those kinds of decks being seen, where they just want to turn 1 ping Tarkin Town you down and then be able to take over the board from there. And Ray as a leader actually offers you options with these X4s in being able to play around the Tarkin Town, because you can play these on turn 1. Your opponent then pings them with like an ISB agent or with an Underworld if they're playing CAD, that sort of thing. And then you can immediately use your Ray leader skill to buff it up to a 1/4 in the case of Moisture Farmer or a 2/4 in the case of R2D2, which just puts it out of that range of the Tarkin Town ping. So they're not able to kill your turn 1 play, and then from there, every time they ping it down, you're then able to buff it up again with the Ray skill. So you're actually able to just stabilize the ground arena really early. You do have to play slightly behind curve with Ray, is an important thing to note. But we've got quite a high density of like lower costed cards to try and help facilitate that as well. This deck is really built to try and help deal with the Tarkin Town decks, especially Django Tarkin Town. And also just trying to help deal with the Sabine matchup as well. I felt like when I was playing the Ray Red list that I tried a couple weeks ago, that it had a really nice matchup, or a much stronger matchup into the control decks, especially hard control, because it had a lot of discard outlets. But it struggled way harder into the aggressive decks. And whilst it had a decent matchup into Django, it still lost a lot of games into them where I felt like it shouldn't. Just because of the tools that the leader had available to it. And so that's another big reason why I ended up going with Ray Green over Ray Red. And another good reason is because we're incentivized to run this like high density of lower costed cards, it actually allows us to make for a really solid go wide strategy against decks like CAD or Django Tarkin Town, which really they want to keep you on like 1 to 2 units, and then that's where they're really strongest as decks, because Django wants to be able to tap down your strongest unit every turn to win the race against you. CAD wants to be able to basically kill the 1 unit that you play every turn with ambush effects and the ping, to be able to effectively ambush for 1 extra damage than they should be able to. So if you're able to go wide against either of those decks, and that's why the Tarkin Town is particularly strong in those shells, if you're able to go wide against either of those styles of decks, then it really, really hurts their game plan, because with CAD, they might play a 4-lom trying to ambush your 5 health unit, but if you're able to put the ping somewhere else on the board, like even these 0/4s, playing them later into the game just as 0/4s, they're able to sit there and absorb CAD pings for a couple of turns, whilst you then buff them up as well. And then same sort of thing for Django. Like a lot of the time what I'm trying to do against Django is I'm starting off with an X5 by playing one of these guys turn 1 and buffing it, and then playing around the Tarkin Town. And then sometimes against Django I'll just buff it up again, play 2 more 1-drops down, and from there it's really hard for them to race you, because like the Moisture Farmer has Restore 2, it's effectively swinging through for whatever its attack that you buff it to, plus the 2 that you're restoring. And then, you know, we've got some other 1-drops that I'll go through as well. But those are kind of the main reasons why I really wanted to play Ray at the moment. I feel like Ray as a leader offers quite a lot into these like Tarkin Town and just general aggro decks in the format right now. And the reason why I wanted to play green, I touched on it a little bit earlier. I felt that the green offered a lot more into the aggressive decks. I feel like we're in a pretty aggressive format right now. At least since the Birmingham tournament, we haven't seen a huge amount of Bosk Blue going on, and I feel like that deck you really have to grind out a deck like Bosk Blue to know how to play it into the current field as well. And we just haven't reached that point where people have figured out, or where a majority of people have figured out the Bosk Blue deck into the current format, or decks like Kira and the other sort of control decks, Krennic as well. So I wanted a deck that could really do well into the more aggressive decks right now. And I felt like green offered that a lot better than red. Red was a lot more focused on the discard side of things, which isn't as helpful into the aggressive decks. Whereas green offers things like ramp, which just lets you get your flip off a little bit faster, can be really relevant into those like 5 and 6 deploy leaders like Cad and Django again. Being able to flip a turn earlier than Cad or on the same turn as Django can be absolutely huge in those matchups. It also offers extra Space Sentinels in the form of Bright Hope, which is insanely strong into the Django matchup. Again, we'll cover that once I get to the Bright Hopes. But yeah, absolutely amazing there to pair with the Concord Dawn Interceptors. And I found that it also offers just like really good top end into those control decks. It's not like green just auto loses to control, as opposed to like red auto winning into it. I feel like REY Green still has a really solid control matchup, especially post sideboard as well. Like I was saying, I kind of tutored my main deck to be focused on those aggressive matchups, so a lot of the sideboard is dedicated to the control decks, but that's the kind of thing that I could look at changing if the meta shook up a little bit more. And overall, green just offers like some really interesting tech choices that keeps the deck flexible. Like I was saying, I feel like the deck has a solid matchup into control whilst really being able to beat down on those aggro and slightly faster mid-range decks as well. But I'll continue going through with the deck. So in terms of the X4s here, we've got the 3 R2s and the 3 Moisture Farmers. There was definitely a consideration for me to play Warrior Drone over the Moisture Farmer, and there was also a period of time where I was side decking some Warrior Drones just so I could really focus on hard mulliganing for these X4s in the Django and Cad matchups. Especially into Django, I actually don't feel like these are as necessary to open up with. I think you're still pretty favored into that matchup even if you don't open with this, because a lot of the early drops that we're playing are naturally very strong into that deck anyways, and we also have a lot of other tools to help with that matchup. But especially into the Cad matchup, you definitely want to see if you can open this. Otherwise you're forced to pass into them and then hand them initiative without really developing as great of a threat onto the ground arena to contest them. But the reason why I ended up with Moisture Farmer over the Warrior Drone was just for the Restore 2. I felt like it was going to be a little bit more helpful into the Sabine matchup, but I also felt like against Django in particular, it was going to be a real threat in the ground arena because it's really hard for them to Tarkin Town this. It's going to take them 2 or 3 pings to be able to actually Tarkin Town this, and that's a lot of investment from a Django, because then you're going to be able to develop other bigger threats than a Moisture Farmer that then they're not tapping down during those 2 or 3 turns that they're pinging this down. This is also able to actually like end up trading quite nicely into a Crafty Smuggler if they're being stubborn that they don't want to use the Tarkin Town on this. Then this can eventually trade up into a Crafty Smuggler, or even value trade over it once you buff it enough, because it's got the potential to be buffed 3 times, whereas Warrior Drone has only got the potential to be buffed twice because of the 1 attack that it has. And yeah, it's mainly just for that Restore 2 effect, obviously. That just makes it a real threat into the Django matchup, and it makes it really hard for them to be able to push a lot of damage without having to burn a lot of resources on just a guy that you played on turn 1 that they'd normally be able to ping Tarkin Town off. And it gives you that extra time to develop those other Restore threats or other bigger threats in general that you really want to get to against Django. For the only 2-drop that I'm actually playing a playset of, the Restored Arc 170, and again, this is a card that I'm playing at playset because it's so good into Django. It's just a turn 1, 2, 3. It can nicely trade into a Kylo's TIE Silencer or a Mercenary Gunship, or an Elite P-38 that they might play on turn 2. And if this card ends up sticking around past turn 1, you're able to buff it to a 3/4, at which point it value trades into the Kylo's TIE. It trades evenly still with the Elite P-38, but it value trades into their turn 1 plays in space, which is huge. And there were some games where when I started with initiative, I was able to do that. And there is room for punishment because if you buff this up and they go for an elite P38, they can then tap it down with Django and then Tarkin Town in next action. That can be really huge. But in the games where I was going for it, it was generally when I'd opened multiple copies of the Restored Arc, so I was still able to then develop a second one straight afterwards and just threaten the same thing again next turn. So just a really nice 2-drop all around for the Django matchup, and especially nice when you want to keep initiative. A big problem with this deck can be that you are sacrificing initiative by playing these like 1-drops plus using your leader skill in the same turn. It's very rare that I ended up with initiative going into turn 2 because I'm playing a high density of 1-drops as opposed to what I normally see in a REY list. And speaking of which, another 1-drop that I was on was the Clone Deserter, 2 copies. This ended up being a very last minute change, literally the night before the tournament. I put some of these into the main deck. I was initially just sideboarding 2 copies of this for the Sabine matchup, but I got a little bit concerned about how the Sabine matchup was. I still felt like it was fairly favored for me, but I was thinking like I don't want to have the situation come up where I drop a Moisture Farmer on turn 1 and buff it to a 1/5, and then they have like a Battlefield Marine or a Sabine and they just Fleet Lieutenant kill the Moisture Farmer. I don't get a return trade or anything, and then I'm super behind on the board from there. And that was a slight downside to these 1/4s, is whilst they are really strong into the Tarkin Town decks, they can be a little bit weaker into the Sabine, especially if, like I say, they open that kind of opener. Whereas Clone Deserter is an insane card into the Sabine matchup. It becomes a 3/4 on turn 1 with Restore 1. So it is literally better stat lines than Battlefield Marine, which is kind of considered the best 2-drop in the game in terms of stats right now. And like the Rebel synergy that Battlefield Marine has doesn't have any relevance in this deck. Obviously, this card has the bounty that lets them draw a card, but you don't really care about that in an aggressive matchup. And this card is effectively swinging 4 damage every time you attack with it because of the Restore 1 as well. It's a really, really insane card, and again, against a deck like Django, if you're able to go wide with these 1-drops, like we're on 8 1-drops here with the 6 X4s plus the 2 Clone Deserters. So it means that your turn 2, turn 3, you can start actually just going wide and pressuring them because you have the 5 health advantage from your Echo Base as opposed to the Tarkin Town, as well as having like the early restore units in the Clone Deserter, the Restored Arc, that kind of thing. So yeah, this card was absolutely insane, and because of the fact that this felt like just a better card than Battlefield Marine, because of the fact you buff it with REY on turn 1, that was the main reason why I ended up choosing not to run Battlefield Marine anywhere in the list, was because I was really focused on beating out on these Tarkin Town decks with the X4s and beating out on Django with the Restored Arc especially. And then this was going to help me much more than a Battlefield Marine would against Sabine. It is a little bit of a shame not having that many 2-drops because it can make your turn 2 a little bit more clunky, because you'd ideally a lot of the time want to buff your turn 1 unit a second time, especially if it's an R2 or a Moisture Farmer, and then play a 2-drop straight afterwards, or play a 2-drop and then buff it with REY as well. But Battlefield Marine can't be buffed, so there are a lot of situations where you won't be able to do that with the Marine anyways, and I really wanted to have the option to potentially like buff my turn 1, play it a second time on turn 2, and then spawn 2 more 1-drops down. I felt like that would really solidify the game against Django, and that is what ended up happening, both in testing and in practice. And then for the final early drops, I was actually choosing to main deck 2 Scanning Officer. This was just a respect to double Han Yellow, or double Yellow Han even. I felt like that matchup was going to be the hardest matchup that I had on the day. It's not a matchup that I'm at all experienced in. I have to admit, it was definitely a deck that I neglected to test against because I just didn't have time, to be honest. And I was really focused on like making sure that my Django and Sabine matchups were really cleaned up, as well as like feeling out some of the control matchups just to make sure I didn't auto lose to them. So Han Yellow was definitely a deck that I went into the tournament very underprepared for. And that ended up unfortunately being what I played in the last round. It was one of those situations where you look next to you and you see two Django mirror matches, and you look to the other side and there's a Django versus a Sabine, and that's all the other people in your bracket, and you're like, why did I have to pair the one Han yellow? So unfortunately, that's just how it goes sometimes with card games. So this was a respect call to Han Yellow. I wanted to main deck these so that I felt like I had a chance in game one. Unfortunately, I just didn't draw them in game one anyways, so it didn't really matter. If there was a card I'd replace with Battlefield Marine, it would probably be this card, but I could also see this coming out for the third Clone Deserter, as well as like another flex spot later in the list. I feel like right now, though, it is probably important to have a couple of these in the main deck still, because Han Yellow is a very, very prominent deck right now. And unless you can figure out a better way to beat the deck than I can, then I feel like this card is pretty necessary into the matchup. So that's all of the early drops. I think I'm on 13 turn 1 plays in total. Yeah, that's 13 turn 1 plays in total, which is like a pretty high density. I think that's normally what Sabine is on, which obviously really wants to see a turn 1 play, as it's such an aggressive deck. But it's really helped out by the fact that you can fill out your curve so nicely with the REY leader skill as well. That drawing these on like turn resource 3, 4, and 5 is actually fine a lot of the time, because you're often playing a couple of cards per turn plus using your REY leader skill anyways. So going on to the 3 drops, we've got 3 Village Protectors. This card is just insane, to be honest. This card probably single-handedly stabilized me so many different games. And it's also kind of the ideal card to play alongside your REY flip turn. Because a card like Obi-Wan a lot of the time gets punished by things like Waylay, whereas this card is almost guaranteed to take 2 actions to get through, or it's going to trade up into a card like Takedown. And if it's trading up, then that's obviously good, but if it's taking them 2 actions, then you have your action in between to flip the REY, and then the action afterwards to swing the REY to buff it up, so that it's a lot harder to kill. So yeah, I mean, Village Protectors is great. Into the rest of the 3 drops, I went on a 2-2 split of Yoda and Sundari Peacekeeper. Yoda is obviously an amazing card, especially into the control matchups, because it really lets you win that game of attrition, and even into a lot of the mid-range matchups. Like, I find Yoda is especially good into other heroic mid-range decks, like other blue-green heroic decks or blue-red heroic decks, that sort of thing. Just being able to win that war of attrition is really strong. But the Force Synergy is like really not that relevant in this deck. I don't think I'm running any Force Synergy cards at all. So having the Sundari Peacekeeper as another 3-drop that kind of pairs nicely and effectively does the same job as Yoda, as being like a 2 restore unit to swing in with, feels really good. Whereas Yoda offers you the draw when it dies, Sundari Peacekeeper just acts as a 3/5 a lot of the time. Sure, sometimes they'll be able to trade into it, but they oftentimes don't kill it on turn 2 or turn 3 when you drop it. They're not able to get through 5 health immediately. And once you start buffing this card up into like a 2/6 or a 3/7 even, this card can like single-handedly just race your opponent down, because then it starts swinging for 5 because it's got the raid 2. It starts swinging for like 4 or 5 damage, plus restoring you 2. There were some games where I had this on 3 attack base, so it was swinging for 5, and then it was restoring 2. It's just getting you a 7 health surplus every swing, which is actually insane value for a 3-drop that you've buffed twice. And it also, after 1 buff, gets you out of range of cards like Takedown, which is huge. It's just a really solid all-round card. It especially helps you into those aggressive matchups. Again, because it's a 5 health unit, it can't immediately be pinged Tarkintown. And so going into those middle of the game turns, like turn 3, turn 4, once you've stabilized the board early with your X5s, with the R2s and the Moisture Farmers, and you don't need to buff them anymore because your opponent's kind of given up on pinging them, or you've developed other units that you can have take the CAD ping, then you can start dropping this guy and have it soak up some other pings, and then start buffing it out of the Tarkintown range again. Whereas Yoda can kind of immediately, unless you're instantly able to buff it because you're dropping it on turn 3 or later, then it can immediately get ping Tarkin Towned. So dropping this card on 2 against those Tarkin Town decks once you've dropped the X5 on turn 1 can actually be really not that great to do, unless they've already tapped under any ping effects. But yeah, I found like a 2-2 split of the Sundari Peacekeeper and the Yoda worked really well. And then going into the Space Sentinels, I was on 3 Concord Dawn Interceptors and 2 Bright Hopes. There was a part of me that really wanted to main deck 3 Bright Hopes because it's obviously so good into Django, but it also helps you into those control matchups, just being able to draw extra cards and bounce units that might be damaged or have solid on-play effects, that sort of thing. But I felt like the Django matchup was already strong enough just with the main deck alone that I didn't need the 3rd Bright Hope in the main. And there were better cards that I could run for a control matchup. So honestly, the deck space in this list was really tight. There were some really tough decisions I had to make, and I'll get into that as well in a bit. But yeah, obviously Bright Hope and Concord Dawn are amazing cards. Concord Dawn being able to soak up any of their 3 attack swings early and live unless it's a P38. But if it soaks up a 3 damage swing or it soaks up a ping, then you're immediately able to buff it out of the range of the other one that they haven't done. Because oftentimes they want to ping this and then swing a 3 attack into it early on to trade. As soon as you get that buff down, they have to kind of swing 2 attacks into it or wait for a Fire Spray or a Ruthless Raider to come down. And then Bright Hope, similar sort of thing, except it takes an entire Fire Spray swing. And then again, you're able to buff it out of the range of the ping, so they're forced to play a Ruthless Raider to deal with it. And that's a lot of investment just for a 4-drop there. Also, if you're able to get the buff before they can develop the Fire Spray and swing into it, then once Fire Spray does swing into it, you're able to take it out with a return trade from the Bright Hope or with a Vigilance. So it really gets the Fire Spray into much nicer ranges, unless you've already got like a Fel the Dragon. But yeah, the Space Sentinels are kind of self-explanatory in the current meta. Another great card that green offers us is Resupply. This is the only ramp card I'm running. I don't think that Spark of Hope is that great for this deck. I know I've seen some lists running it. I don't even like tech for this deck. I've tried it out at 1 copy for a while. I literally never played it in testing. Even against control decks, I just found that there were much better plays I could be making. And I don't think that it wins you the hard control matchup as hard as some of the other cards do. Which I've got in the sideboard, which I'll go through as well. So I ended up just being on Resupply. A lot of the time that I saw this, even when I saw it in my opening hand, I wasn't casting this on turn 2. And I think... so the reason why I wasn't doing that is I believe that this deck is quite naturally very reliant on the board. You know, the leader needs units on the board to buff. There's not a lot of like on-play effects that just immediately go, I'm going to kill that or ambush this, or there's not a huge amount of immediate impact that these units have. A lot of them are quite slow naturally, unfortunately. Even the Sentinels, like if they get bounced or immediately killed before they get the buff or before they get any sort of value trades, then they're not doing a whole lot. So once you lose the board on this deck, it really becomes tricky to bring the game back into your own control. So the reason I didn't want to play this on turn 2 a lot of games was because I felt like just playing a second unit on turn 2, or as many units as I could if I opened a bunch of 1-drops, felt a lot better, because then on turn 3 I could resupply plus use my leader to buff again, which would often get me a lot better value trades on the board, but also take me out of a lot of tradable ranges on the board. And then I go from 4 resource to 6 resource, at which point I can flip, play like 2 3-drops or an Obi-Wan or a Vigilance, that sort of thing. And from there, the deck just curves out a lot better. I find that the 4 resource turn is kind of okay to play through, because you can play like a 3-drop plus a buff, or you can play Bright Hope being the only 4-drop unit that I play. We do play some 4-drop events, but they're not really ones that you want to play actually on 4 resource a lot of the time. So generally it's just going to be a 3-drop and a buff, or a 2-drop or 1-drop and a buff, that sort of thing. So the 4 resource turn is not that tricky to play through. I find that the 5 resource turn is the one that I really struggle with, and I think that's why a lot of people play Spark of Hope in the deck, is because it offers you that 2 mana play plus a 3 drop, or plus like a 2 drop and a buff, and then you can also immediately flip. So I really wanted to use Resupply just as a tool to skip the 5 resource turn rather than skipping the 4 resource turn by playing it on turn 2 and also losing control of the board by doing that. I feel like playing this on turn 3 is a lot better of a play personally. There were even some times where I was playing it on turn 4, so on the 5 resource turn. Especially if I had a 1-drop in hand, I could play this, play a 1-drop buff, and then I could immediately deploy. I didn't even have to wait for next turn because this puts me to 6 resource. And that also ended up catching a lot of people off guard who were like setting up to deal with my REY next turn as soon as it flipped. And then because I flipped it this turn, they can no longer deal with it because I've already got it out of that 6 health range. So I feel like in this deck you just don't want to play Resupply on turn 2. I feel like you save it for turn 3 or turn 4 just to help you curve out a little bit smoother and also maintain control of that board. And then you still get to your flip faster by doing that, and that's really your power play. But it just helps you curve out a little bit stronger. So going into the bigger cards, I've got 2 Obi-Wans. I feel like this is just not a card you can run at 3. Especially in this current meta, because yellow is everywhere, to be honest. This card just loses to Waylay so quickly. I don't think there's a huge number of Django lists that main deck Waylay, but it's a card that some lists will main deck, and a lot of lists might sideboard as well. Cad Bane is definitely going to run Waylay because they're running Jabba. Double yellow Han is going to be running definitely Cunning and probably also Waylay, that both destroy this card. So like, this is not a card that you can just drop and expect to be okay against everything. You really have to think about the matchup to figure out whether you can safely get away with playing this card. There are definitely some times where like this is, ironically enough, your only hope. You just have to play it and hope that they can't deal with it, and then use it as a way to get your action to flip, and then you can obviously, once it dies, buff the REY. Or even if they just kill it with the same action, it still gives you that one action to flip. And if you've got something else on the board, then you can buff that to use that to trade into stuff as well. But this is not an incredible card, unfortunately, just because of the way that the meta is shaping up. And that's why I didn't want to have it at 3 copies. I still put it in at 2 copies just because there are matchups that aren't, well, there are decks in the meta that don't play yellow. There are matchups where this card is still really strong. And sometimes playing this on 6, if your opponent doesn't have an efficient answer, just wins you the game. So I wanted to still have the card in the list because there are those opportunities that come up where this card single-handedly carries you because you get to buff your REY and then your REY carries you. But yeah, it's not like an MVP card in the list anymore. It's not kind of set 1 meta days where you could just slam it against everything not Boba and basically just win the game. Obviously 3 Lukes, also 3 home ones. I feel like this card is incredible. I was testing this card at 2 for a while, and I just found that my top end was non-existent almost. It felt like I just never had solid top end when I was testing it at 2 copies. And then I upped it to 3 copies, and I was drawing it pretty much past resource 8 as frequently as you can expect. And yeah, it's just become an MVP card. It's absolutely insane. It's also a lot of the time the key to winning those control matchups because it just gives you so much value and also flexibility. You can get to the point very realistically where you're playing home 1 and respawning your Lukes or Obi-Wans, and I was doing that throughout the tournament as well quite a lot. Just an insane card. And then I'm also running 2 Redemption. This is your stabilization tool against decks like Sabine or Django if you really need it. A lot of the time you don't need this card, to be honest. I have considered cutting this card from the list just because I felt so confident into the Django and Sabine matchups. But I think it's still worth running at the end of the day. Like, there are those times where you just really need to slam this card and it'll win you the game because it trades into Fire Spray, but it also healed you 8 damage or potentially up to 8 damage. Against Django, there are a lot of times where you don't heal for the full 8 because you want to keep this above ping range or above Ruthless Raider range. So make sure to bear that in mind. But yeah, this card just wins you the game against Django a lot of the time. And if you get there against Sabine, it's probably game from there as well. An important omission from the top end list here is that I'm not running any U-Wing reinforcements, which I am a little sad about because it is probably one of my favorite green cards in the game, aside from a card like Choose Sides. This is a very important omission from the list because a lot of the units, I mentioned this earlier, in fact, a lot of the units don't have that immediate impact. In terms of the early units, we're not playing any ambush units in the main list. In fact, I don't think we're playing any ambush units in the deck at all. It is literally just Sentinels that have immediate impact. It's Village Protectors, Concord Dawn, and Bright Hope that do things when they're played or affect the board in a way that matters on the turn that they're played. So U-Wing Reinforcements was a card I was testing around a lot with, and it ended up being that every time I played it, I was just hoping to either hit Luke or Village Protectors, basically. Village Protectors and some form of other cards to fill out the Village Protectors curve. I found that U-Wing was like really not doing all that much for me, and I'd much rather, this was during the time where I was on 2 home 1s as well. Pretty much every time I played U-Wing, I would have much rather played home 1. Most of the time I was just resourcing the U-Wing, and when I played the U-Wing as well, there were some really awkward numbers that came out because I'm playing so many 1-drops and not that many 2-drops in the list. It wasn't like I could go 3-drop, 2-drop, 2-drop a lot of the time. I was having to go 3-drop, 2-drop, 1-drop, which felt really bad. It was slightly nicer when I could go double 3-drop and a 1-drop. But even then, like, I'm not running a huge density of 3-drops that I'm guaranteed to see them all the time as well. So because there's such a wider spread in 1-drops in this list, I felt like U-Wing was just not worth running. It didn't feel like it had that immediate impact that it really supplies in a lot of other decks. And even against Control, which is kind of where the card shines, especially against a hard Control deck, the issue that I found with U-Wing in that is that it takes like 3 cards out of your deck. And a lot of the time they're not very threatening cards because I'm then going to have to spend additional resources in buffing them up with REY. So I'm milling myself 3, which in the matchup against a deck like Bosk Blue, you actually don't want to do that if you can help it. But also I'm milling myself 3 to develop a board of like really non-threatening guys. If they can stick a Charlton or something like that, then a lot of the units that I play wouldn't even be able to trade into that very favorably until I've at least buffed them 2 or 3 times there. And like if we've got to the point where I'm dropping a U-Wing and they're dropping a Super Laser Blast, and then I'm going, okay, I'll play another guy and they'll play Avenger, then I think I've already lost the game. I think there's much better tools against a hard control list or control decks in general than U-Wing Reinforcements right now for this deck at least. So going on to the removal, I guess, package or the spells of the deck. We've got 3 Perilous Position, obviously an insane card in general. Using this on leaders has been crazy. Using this on against Django is obviously busted. One card I did want to give room to talk about was Traitorous. I ended up including this card as a potential 5 resource option because, like I mentioned before, there's no strong option that you play on 5 resource. It is a really clunky turn and you'd much rather just resupply past it. But I did want to give room to a 5 cost that could be played in that slot, and Traitorous was the one I went with. I think it is the strongest 5 resource play for this deck in the color combination that I have. And it's actually a really strong card in this format. Well, it kind of has this very strange place in the meta where it's really strong, but it's really weak because everyone is expecting upgrades and is playing a lot of upgrade removal. So my strategy with this card was I was going to play it in game 1 and use it to try and steal game 1s, and then side it out in game 2 almost every game. Because against the decks that it's not good against, I'm siding it out, and against the decks that it's good against, being mainly Django, Sabine, and other heroic mid-range decks, basically, they often side or main deck upgrade removal. This card is only safe to play against Sabine once they've burned their ECL, because if they ECL Poe and remove this card, you probably just lose the game on the spot. There was a point where I misplayed into that in the tournament as well. I could have played around it and I just didn't, and it was pretty bad. And against Django, they're almost always going to be siding the Disabling Fang Fighter, and if they see you play this in game 1, then they're going to triple dark raid a Disabling Fang Fighter out against you game 2. And against my one Django opponent that I played throughout the day, I used this to steal a very valuable unit. I can't remember what it was, but I think I just stole like a solid 3-2 in space to trade into his other 3-2 in space in game 1. And then game 2 on turn 3, he dropped a Disabling Fang Fighter to like remove an experience, and I'd already sided these out, and I was like, okay, I feel like I made a good call there in doing that. But yeah, it's in this like weird spot where it's an insane card right now, but also everyone is prepared for it just quite naturally. The one matchup where this card does really shine is against other blue heroic decks. Basically, being able to steal Yoda in that matchup is insane, because Yoda is a great card in general because it's swinging 4 damage every time you swing with it, potentially 5 if you buff it with REY. And then when it dies, you get to draw a card, and the attrition is really important in those blue heroic mirror matchups. So I was keeping this in against those kind of decks, but otherwise I was literally just playing it for like game 1, filling out my 5 resource turn, and also cheesing them a little bit because of the power of the card when it's not so expected. And then games 2 and 3, I just sided it out every single time. For the removal spells, we have 3 Fell the Dragon, 1 Takedown. I was on 2 Takedown until literally the night before again. That was one of the cards that I had to cut for the Clone Deserters that I wanted in the main deck. I really wanted this card at 2 copies just because, again, that respect to the double yellow Han deck. This card being potentially an out to Tech or DJ, as well as most of their early plays. Being able to take down Akira as well is really solid. But yeah, I couldn't find another card that I really wanted to cut other than potentially one of the Traitorous. And I felt like Traitorous would have more value because I was going to see much more Sabine and Django throughout the day. But I definitely wanted 3 Fell the Dragon in because I tested with 2 for a long time, and there were games against CAD where I'd seen like perfect curve, and then they dropped a 7-drop CAD and ate my entire board, and I didn't draw Fell the Dragon for like 3 turns and just lost off of it. So I feel like definitely 3 Fell the Dragon is really solid right now. Also, it deals with cards like Fire Spray, Poe, and Rekka. Even against the aggro decks, you want Fell the Dragon, but you also really need it for the control decks so that you can kill cards like Avenger. So it's a really important card in the meta right now, and I feel like you definitely want it at 3. And then last 3 cards are 3 Vigilance. For those of you who don't know, I played a REY Red list in the Nottingham PQ for all of about 3 or 4 rounds. I was not feeling like playing card games that day, so I ended up dropping, especially after some really unfortunate losses and misplays as well. But what I did learn when I was playing that deck was I was maining 2 Vigilance and siding the 3rd copy as a potential other 6 resource play for decks that I didn't want to slam Obi-Wan into. And what I found was that I was siding the 3rd Vigilance in every single game, and that remained the case in testing after that as well. So the 3rd Vigilance definitely made a lot more sense in the main board. So going into the sideboard now, and bear in mind, again, a lot of this is for the control decks. Like I mentioned, the main board is really, really focused on beating those aggro decks. So we've got the sideboard for control. And the first card is my favorite card in the game, Choose Sides. This card is insane. It's such a good card for green to have access to. And being able to pair it with cards like Fell the Dragon in those control matchups means that, sure, they have 3 Avengers, but you have 6 answers to it. And Choose Sides is also going to force them to then answer their own Avenger, which means they'll have less answers to cards like Luke and Home 1 that you play later on. This is a card that I really want in the main board, because against any mid-range deck, this card can often just win you games, because like they play a Luke to answer your Luke, you play a Luke to answer their Luke, they play a Luke to answer your Luke, and then you steal their Luke by giving them like a Moisture Farmer. And it really capitalizes on the high density of 1-drops that we have in the deck, because it means that very, very reliably from 8 resources we can resolve this card even without having that much of a board presence. Another reason why I really want this card in the main board is if you're able to get the ramp off against a Django, sorry, you're able to start stealing their Ruthless Raiders and their Fire Sprays on the turns that they're playing them for actually 6 resource, which can be absolutely huge. The only thing I would be concerned about is that I don't know if by that point you have like expendable units on the board that you just want to give them for free. It's a lot of the time the case that I've buffed my units quite a lot by that point, and they've also got Restore, and I'd actually rather have them than the Ruthless Raider in the first place, because they're going to be harder for my opponent to deal with than a Ruthless Raider would be. That's much more of a theory thing. I haven't actually tested it, but I know that I used to play this card in a lot of green decks against Boba Yellow, just to be able to steal a Fire Spray as soon as they slammed it, and then slam them for face instead. So it was really strong in that matchup, so I imagine that it's kind of a similar thing in the Django matchup, but it would require a little bit more testing. This card was mainly there for the other mid-range and control decks. The next card is another one of my dear favorites, the Rogue Squadron Skirmisher. Again, this was there for a couple of reasons. This was there for mainly the control decks. It gives you that extra value. It kind of automatically 2-for-1s, and it can a lot of the time 3-for-1 if you're able to resolve a solid ambush. But it also is there for those decks that Obi-Wan just loses to. Like if you're against a yellow deck and you don't feel like, especially a yellow Han deck, where they're going to be running Cunning and Waylay, so multiple options to deal with your Obi-Wan, then it's very unlikely that you have a point where it's safe to actually play the Obi-Wan. So a lot of the time I was siding the Obi-Wans out for this card because it has that immediate impact. I didn't play the card all day, unfortunately. It is mainly there for those control matchups, and I didn't end up having to side out the Obi-Wan all that much throughout the day either. But yeah, I think the card is really solid, and it's also a card that I tried in the main deck for a little while, but I just wanted to really make sure I had the main deck tuned for the aggressive matchups. And speaking of the aggressive matchups, we have the third Bright Hope. This is there for Django primarily. I also ended up playing a very space-focused Quinlan Tarkington deck on the day, so that came in there. It is also there for control matchups, and I'll speak about that a little bit in a second as well. I'm on the third Clone Deserter, mainly for Sabine. This ended up coming in quite a lot in general as well, just when I had like bad cards that I wanted to take out, again like the Obi-Wan being an example there. I think I also ended up siding this card in against Django quite a lot, just because I could take out a couple of home ones against Django pretty reliably and know that I wasn't really worried about dropping home 1 in that matchup. And I'd much rather just go wide with Clone Deserters past turn 2, turn 3. Scanning Officer, third copy. These are all just like cards that I'm already main decking for specific matchups that I'll side deck the third copy if it comes to it. I'm a big fan of doing things like that. And the Scanning Officer is obviously for the double yellow Han. Again, it came in against things like Sabine when I was just siding out home ones because I knew I wasn't getting to 8 resource. Or if I got there, then I'd already won the game. So just having another early drop that could maybe help me fill out my 5 resource turn. And then the last 2 cards is another card that I would have loved to have found the space to main deck just to have a whole deck full of turn 1 plays, is the Regional Governor. The theory behind this card was that it was going to help me a lot against control decks. Again, I didn't really play any control throughout the day, but during my testing this card was really solid. The theory behind this was just to play it, especially against hard control, but you can play it against soft control as well, for that extra value. Especially against hard control, you want to play it and just call Super Laser Blast most of the time. Again, it depends on the situation a little bit, but the main reason it is there is to block out Super Laser Blasts. And again, against soft control, you'll have even more options that you probably want to call, like Vaders or Mauls, or I guess Avenger applies to both of them a little bit. But yeah, Super Laser Blast is the main card that I wanted to call with this Regional Governor. Obviously, I can potentially play it early and buff it up as well, but mainly for the Super Laser Blast. And then the theory was that I could start slamming down Rogue Squadron skirmishers against hard control, especially. I'm going to have the time to do this and just keep cycling back the regional governor, keep developing units, and then dropping a regional governor to cool Super Laser Blast so they have a really tough time getting through it and getting through any boards that I develop. And then again, against hard control, because I'm going to just have the time to do this because the games go that length. You can start using Bright Hope to bounce back the Rogue Squadron skirmishers if they stick around, or even just playing both on the same turn. And once you get past the point of like, I think 13 or 14, 14 resources. Can I count? No, it's 11 resources. Once you get past the point of 11 resources, is when you can start dropping home ones. You can go home one, play Rogue Squadron skirmisher, potentially ambush something, grab back regional governor, and this is where home one is starting to go like 3 or 4 for 1, because then you can immediately go regional governor, cool Super Laser Blast, and this whole board is protected. And then if they're not able to deal with this, then next turn you go Bright Hope, bounce back the Rogue Squadron, draw a card, Rogue Squadron, grab back another regional governor once it's been dealt with, and you can really just start looping this to block out any of their potential answers. Like I say, a lot of the time it will be the Super Laser Blast, but there are times where you'll want to call other things. If you've got a smaller board, you might want to call Avenger or Snoke if you've got a board of 2 health units, Palpatine if you've got a board of like 6 or less total health. So that sort of thing there. But that was the theory, and it worked really well in testing. I didn't play against any control decks, so can't tell you how it worked in practice, I'm afraid. In terms of my matchups, I'll run through them very quickly. Round 1, I played against an Obi-Wan ECL, and I took that match 2-0. The main thing was just playing around an Ayla Secura ECL on my deploy. I also saw ramp both games, which was very important in that kind of mirror matchup. Round 2 was against the Quinlan Tarkintown Space. My deck, unfortunately for him, was very, very well built to deal with an all-space deck because I'm prepping against Django, and it's kind of doing the same thing but a little bit faster, or a little bit earlier at least. So I already had the 5 Space Sentinels in the main deck, 3 Vigilance, and then I sided into more Space Sentinels and more early drops. And also, like, a thing with Quinlan Tarkintown especially is that a lot of the time they're not playing a high density of 1-drops for them to open in the early turns. So even if I'm opening just Clone Deserter, a lot of the time they just are playing a 2-drop and then they can't ping it because it doesn't cost the same as a Clone Deserter, and I can buff it up and start swinging for 3 damage each time plus restoring 1, which is even more value than an A-Wing provides in the space. And also they're on the 25 health base, so in game 2 against him I was actually able to just race him because I opened a Clone Deserter and I think he opened an A-Wing, and the Clone Deserter stuck around for most of the game there. And I also, like, once you get to the deploy with that kind of a start, you're really just able to race them very quickly because you've healed so much throughout the game with these really, really minute restores just adding up. Round 3 was against a Tarkin Blue, and this one I unfortunately lost 2-1. This was a really sad game, just because I didn't open 2-drops for, I think, 2 of the games that I lost, or the 2 games that I lost. I don't think I opened a 2-drop in either. And it just meant that, like, I could establish a 3-drop, he would power the dark side it, he'd keep buffing it his turn 1 unit, and then his turn 1 unit was just value trading over anything that I tried to play. Like I say, with this deck, once you lose the board, it's really hard to come back into the game. And that's why I really wanted to make sure that I had, like I said, 13 turn 1 plays, so that that kind of thing didn't happen too consistently. But unfortunately, Tarkin Blue is kind of similar to REY in the same, well, REY Green especially, in the same vein that, like, once you lose the board, it's really hard to play the game, because your main value comes from buffing your early units. And yeah, once I open a hand of no 2-drop into a deck that's kind of playing the same game plan as me, it's really hard to get the board back, unfortunately. Round 4, I played against a CAD Tarkintown, which was another 2-0 for me. That matchup is really hard for CAD to play, especially if you see ramp. I find that it's not even necessary to play an X4 if you see the ramp. Like, seeing the ramp against a CAD is just huge because you get the deploy a turn before them. And I think even in game 1, he was dropping Cloud Riders to start clearing out my R2s that I was playing to try and stabilize the board, which was the best way for him to deal with them at the time, but also I was very okay with it because it meant that we were going later on into the game, and I think my deck just has much better top end than a Cad Tarkintown anyways. And I was just able to really stabilize the game by using a choose sides to take down a Ruthless Raider whilst I already had a Luke on board. And that was just kind of game from there. Round 5, I played against a Sabine ECL and I managed to take it 2-0. Game 1 of that match was absolutely insane. He had gone deploy Dark Saber into next turn ECL Poe, into next turn Wrecker, into Poe, into Wrecker. So he had seen like the perfect Sabine top end curve and was just beating down on me. And as you may have seen throughout the list, I don't actually have an answer to a Dark-Sabered Sabine. I'm not playing a card like Rivals Fool because it's too slow for the combo anyways, and I'm not playing any upgrade removal in the deck at all. So that is a bit of a pitfall in the deck, but you do have Perilous Position, you do have Village Protectors, you do have just kind of naturally a lot of Restore. And because of those tools, I was able to actually take that game, despite his Dark-Sabered Sabine living for, I think, the entire game up until the last turn where I used a Vigilance to kill it and heal 5. I dropped one Perilous Position on it to stall it out, and I dropped a Village Protectors, and then I got to the point where I dropped a Home 1 to replay the Village Protectors to block it off for a turn again. And Home 1, I think, swung 3 times throughout the game and was eventually the card that killed him. So absolutely insane game there. Yeah, it was crazy. Round 6 was against a Django Tarkintown. Unfortunately, my first one throughout the day and my only one as well. I was really hoping to see more Django Tarkintown. Every time I looked next to me, there was a Tarkintown Django next to me. And a lot of the time, those were mirrors as well. And there were 4 Django Tarkintowns, I believe, that made it into the top 8. So it was a really, really highly represented deck throughout the day. I was just really unfortunate not to see it, especially when I was XO and X1 for most of the day. But this Django in particular is one of my locals, Alec, and I've known him for a really long time because we used to play Yu-Gi-Oh together like 10 years ago. And I know that he's been on Django for a while. And I managed to take the match 2-0. Game 1 was really favored to me, I feel like, and then game 2 was a little bit closer. I think I slightly misplayed it, and it gave him the opportunity to like if he had an out to the Luke that I developed on the turn where I killed him, then it might have been a little bit harder for me to push through that last damage. But yeah, overall the matchup is really, really hard for a Django to play. And he was saying that after the game, and he is definitely a solid Django player, so I felt pretty comfortable once I'd taken the match 2-0 from him that I wasn't going to lose to a Django if I played any more throughout the day. And then unfortunately round 7 is where we ran into the double yellow Han, and the only one in the top tables, both undefeated and X1 bracket. This was the only one, I think, and maybe even in the X2 bracket as well, I'm not sure. So I was a little bit salty about having the unfortunate luck of running into my one guy playing my bad matchup in the last round to take me out from the top cut potential, and push me down to 16th based on tiebreakers. But like I say, sometimes that's just how it goes. But overall, I feel like the deck is really solid. I feel like if you have a good run or a better run than I did with the deck, you see a couple more Djangos, a couple more Sabines, a couple more Cads, and a little bit less Han Yellow, or just the one is probably okay, then I feel like the deck has got a decent shot at... I think the deck can very easily top a PQ. I feel like it's got a decent shot at being able to take the whole thing down, to be honest. And I will probably continue working on it for another PQ soon. It's definitely a deck that I really enjoyed, and I would like to give it another shot to see if I can get some better matchups at the next one. But yeah, overall, I really hope you enjoyed the video. I know it's been a long one. I really wanted to get into the weeds of the deck and explain my thought processes throughout playing it and throughout building it. I got to give a massive shout out to Krish for having me over for the London PQ and letting me stay at his. And yeah, let me know any feedback on the video down below as always. and I will catch you guys in the